Oh, hello, Esther. Glad you came down. Say, sit down here. I want to read you something. This is really terrific. Look. They have clubbed us off the streets. They are stronger. They are rich. They hire and fire the politicians, the newspaper editors, the small men with reputations, the college presidents, the ward heelers. They hire the men with guns, the uniforms, the police, the patrol wagons.
My gracious, that's powerful writing. What is it?
That from USA by John Dos Passos.
Oh, why, yes, of course I should have known that anything so realistic would be from Dos Passos.
Well, not necessarily. He wasn't the only realistic writer we had. Although I'll admit this bit I just read was pretty realistic. He was thinking about big business and the control it had there just before the crash. He might also have been thinking of the Sacco Vanzetti case. He was a bitter man. Of course, a lot of them were bitter then.
Well, I don't know, Howard. I don't think bitter quite so much as realistic, don't you think? Now, this Dos Passos, he was writing during the Depression, wasn't he?
Yes, that's true. He, along with William Faulkner and Erskine Caldwell and James T. Farrell, that whole gang of realists.
You know, Howard, for anyone who never misses a chance to tell me that the arts reflect the times, you're mighty slow on the trigger.
Oh, I'm not so slow tonight. It's just that you're a little too fast for me. I was getting around to it.
Well, I should hope so. Was such a period to be slow on? Literature of the 1930s, really?
Okay, dear, don't rub it in.
Well, no, I'll leave that for your students.
Say, and they're just the little gang that can do it, too. It's going to be interesting discussing the Depression-era literature with those kids. No, they're lucky in a way. They really don't remember what it was like.
Well, all they have to do is to read just a little bit more of USA or some of the other works that were written then, and they'll know all about it.
Yes, you're so right. See, the novelists had the feeling that, well, America was desperately ill. And this illness was being reflected in the degeneration of the people.
Well, Howard, that just isn't too hard to understand, though, because here all our idealism that we had before and during World War I is all gone, and...
Yes, I know. It was the shock of the Depression, the suddenness and the horror of it. It just completely wiped out all that fine, traditional American optimism.
And the writer really was a social critic, wasn't he?
Yes, why not? Look what he saw around him all. My goodness, bitter, grinding poverty, complete lack of hope, sordidness. Say, you remember that book we have, that picture book that shows what the writers are writing about?
Well, yes, of course. And I remember when we got it, you said, now this is quite a commentary on what the Depression did to us.
Yes, I remember. Well, it's no wonder the writers were using the candid camera approach. And if they were going to be true social artists, they had no choice but to record what they saw around them.
Well, let's look at some of those pictures again. The book's down here, isn't it?
Yes, right here on the shelf, I think. If you excuse me a minute to get my big feet down off of here, and we'll have a look.
Okay.
It's right here. Well, now look at that, for instance. See, during the farmers were badly hit, that's true. And millions of the southern farmers were just reduced to utter ruin. That's what Erskine Caldwell's Tobacco Road was all about.
Oh, and look, now that's something that William Faulkner would write about, too.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Hey, take a look at this shot of Highway 66 leading out to the west. Now, that's the route that was traversed by the migrant farmers as they fled to the promised land of California.
Oh, look at that deserted farm. You know, John Steinbeck must have seen hundreds just like that when he wrote Grapes of Wrath.
Yes, it just shows that the writing during the 30s was a stock-taking of the utter failure of our social and economic traditions.
Oh, look. Now that depicts the Depression more realistically than any.
Yes, sadly true. Chicago slums. The brutal background of James T. Farrell's Studs Lonigan.
Well, that looks like New York.
Yes, it is. That would be a scene from USA, Dos Passos book. You see, the Depression was the same in New York as it was in Chicago.
Well, seemed to me the Depression was the same every place. You remember our own children, how bewildered they were when we wouldn't exchange that wicker furniture with the big holes worn in the sides of it.
Yes, how well I remember. They kept reminding us of how horrible it looked.
Well, you know, those youngsters really did do without a lot of things. But they were lucky that they didn't have to go hungry.
Yes, I know. I've never ceased to be thankful for that. But Esther, do you remember the thousands of children who were not that fortunate? You remember... Well, do you really remember what it was like then? Here. Well, look at this. During that lushness and prosperity that was early 1929, the hand that held the ticker tape held the world. The eyes of thousands and thousands of Americans turned to the newspaper's financial pages before they turned to the front page for the comics. Everyone bought stocks and bonds. This market was not confined to bankers only. The housewife, the cab driver, the college student who paid for his education through a recent market tip. All watched and bought. The stock quotations went higher and higher, and money flowed freely. And America rode the crest of a gigantic spending spree. And still the stocks continued to climb, and the whole world reeled with prosperity. Then, in October of 1929, in a few brief weeks, $30 billion in paper stocks vanished into thin air as a financial structure based on fantastic overextension of credit came tumbling down to utter collapse. Hungry men and women stand in line all day in Times Square bread lines. And thousands exist in tar paper shanties on the edge of town, bitterly naming their camps Hoovervilles, after the president who they blamed. And surplus agricultural products like potatoes provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner for hungry children. Six million out of work in 1930. 10 million in 1931. 14 million in 1932, 16 million in 1933. The jobless failed to meet rent payments, moved to poorer areas. Wholesale evictions occurring. 6,000 men selling apples in New York City alone in 1930. President Hoover says, prosperity is just around the corner. But the hungry, bewildered man without a job or a hope wonders which corner. March 4th, 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sworn in as 32nd President of the United States.
All truth frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
So a nation which had almost succumbed to complete paralysis began to find itself again. Yes, and there were a lot of changes made during this administration, too. Here, let me put this book away. You know, Roosevelt was one of the presidents to show how very effective radio could be in making the people familiar with government and how it went on. He put the problem squarely up to the people, and in an understandable way, too.
You know, he did a good job, too, Howard. You know, I remember his radio fireside chats on Sunday evening. They were always so very informal, and, well, it made us familiar with him, and people felt more secure.
Yes, you bet. And that familiar, intimate style he had won him a lot of friends, too. Oh, he knew the value of his radio chats. And you can bet that the leaders in industry and labor and science and so on were quick to learn that they could get a swift response by putting their problems over the radio, too.
You know, I think that radio in general did a lot toward knitting our country together.
Oh, certainly it did. It just leaped right over natural barriers. You can imagine how people who live out away from town, they just tune on their radio, and they have the latest dance tunes or the latest news. You can see how it'd make them feel closer to their fellow Americans. That's that old solidarity trend of the 1930s.
You know, it brought them close to a lot of disc jockeys, too.
Oh, yes, eventually, of course, but there weren't too many records played during the 30s. A lot of the studios had their own orchestras.
Oh, gracious. Why, I thought they'd be tired out playing those instruments all day long.
Oh, mostly it was filling in time between sponsored shows. Oh, I suppose some of the songs were pretty well played to death at that.
But, you know, we loved it, Howard.
Yes, and a good thing we did, because radio was beginning to branch out in all directions.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, the people in the radio industry itself, in the 1930s there, began to experiment with all different kinds of shows.
Oh, I know. You mean soap operas.
Just a small part of the scene, my dear, just a small part of the scene. No, you can't forget those quiz programs and those big giveaway shows. Say, there was a boon to the advertisers. They just kept industry humming with those commercials.
And, you know, I get a thrill when I think of listening to the New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra on Sunday afternoons.
Yes, it's still a thrill.
But, Howard, this depression, didn't it affect the radio industry? Doesn't sound like it with all the new shows starting up.
Well, you see, radio, like all the other industries, was striving to advance. They wanted to overcome the feeling that accompanied the stock market crash. And then it got to be just a little bit fashionable to be haughty about this poverty business, you know. If you could say, oh, poof, we'll come through this all right, you were right in style with society.
So is that what the radio industry said?
That's what it said. They followed right in the trend.
Well,
Of course, there were a lot of unemployed people, too, you know. And they had a lot of time to kill. They bought a lot of radios. Of course, this radio meant a source of news to these people, too.
well, yes, and there certainly was a lot happening in the world at that time to hear about.
Oh, yes. Early 1930, if you tuned in, you might hear, Benito Mussolini, for instance, saying that he had no desire to bring about another war. Later on in the decade, maybe the reports of the floods, or Adolf Hitler, and so on.
Well, it really sounds as though the radio was an important factor in life during the 30s.
Definitely, it had become a very potent social force.
You know, the broadcasters must have had to be terribly careful to, if they didn't say anything wrong over the air.
Oh, I should say they did. With all those millions of people listening, you bet. Well,
Seems to me there was something about Orson Welles. Did he...
oh, say yes, that Orson Welles program. You know, come to think of it, that probably was the best example of the force of radio during that time. That was in 1938.
You know, I didn't hear it, but I remember that, it created a terrific stir.
Oh, stir is hardly the word. Why, it was national hysteria.
You know, and it's funny hard to think of one little radio program affecting so many people. What in the world was in that show?
Well, for the most part, it was just a dance music program, interrupted now and then by bulletins and on-the-spot reports about the invasion of the Atlantic seaboard by men from Mars.
Well, what did they call their program?
War of the Worlds.
Well, didn't the people realize that it was just a radio program?
Apparently not. Why, after the show, the people were panic-stricken. Why, they began to call up everybody, the Army and the Navy and the Boy Scouts and so forth. Why, they began to flee from their homes. Women fainted. One woman even tried to commit suicide. Well, after the show, there was such a panic that the stations that carried the broadcast had to put on special bulletins saying that this program was just a radio play and nothing more.
It certainly sounds very fantastic. In fact, almost unbelievable.
Well, it was true, though. It just demonstrated the force of radio during the 1930s.
You know, I can think of some other examples.
Uh-oh. You're not thinking of those daylight serials again, are you?
Well, now, Howard, you must admit that women do listen to the soap operas. But I didn't have that in mind. No, I was thinking about the Chicago Round Table and the debates on town meeting of the air.
Well, now that's more like. Say, you win the bright red apple. And not a depression apple either. For knowledge of radio facts during the 1930s.
Thanks. And I think that I'll take two when I tell you that the reason I remember these radio discussions is because our city established a town hall meeting and we held regular public forums.
Well, fine. That certainly deserves a second award. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, now I remember. That's when you were connected with that women's group there. Uh-huh. Oh, that tells me where you were when I was working late at the college nights there. Mm-hmm. Off debating somewhere. Probably about how to keep husbands at home, no doubt.
No, really, nothing so involved as that. We discussed wealth and poverty and, all the current issues.
And that isn't involved?
Oh, well, a little, admittedly. Say, come to think of it, I must have my notes on those debates someplace. I must hunt them up. Maybe you can use them on your lectures.
Oh, yes, of course. Now, are they that type of material that would change the fate of nations?
Well, no, but neither are your lectures, dear.
Yes.
Now, I'll go and hunt them up. Would you have an apple, teacher?
Yes, thank you. Now, look, be sure you come back, because I don't want to be left down here in stitches, wondering what you girls were debating about. Well, let's talk about some of the things that are now in the history books. FDR agencies. The political world in the 1930s was dominated by the Democratic regime, the results of the first 100 days of Roosevelt's office. Now, during this period, agency after agency was established swiftly by Roosevelt and Congress. And the government stepped in and took a direct part in helping people to reconstruct their lives. Now, the important thing here was not just giving a handout. It was putting men to work and giving them back their self-respect. One example was the Federal Music Project. It was established in 1935 and provided work for unemployed musicians. And soon there were government-sponsored WPA orchestras giving concerts before millions throughout the entire United States. That's just one of the examples of the type of thing that happened in the 30s that will be recorded in our history books. Now, what about some of the arts during this time? Someone once said that the history of a country could be found in its popular songs. And it seems to me generally true that the things people compose music about are the things which they experience from day to day. Of course, sometimes songs are written just for the amusement of it and have no particular significance and, of course, don't live long under those circumstances. But, well, lest I go on philosophizing, let's take a look at some of the music of the 1930s. You know, there were a lot of things happening in this field during this time. Way back in the early part of the decade, people were suffering from the results of the market crash and the Depression. Now, just on the surface, if you were to look at a list of popular songs written during those days, you wouldn't get much of an indication that there was a depression, but a little closer examination would reveal a few facts. Let's look at some of them. A song that was reflecting the poverty situation was Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? But for the most part, the songs, popular songs during the Depression were trying to get people to forget their problems. And one song read, wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Well, the songs in general took on an optimistic vein. And a tune which became the theme of the Democratic Party and a hit of the day. You'll remember it. Happy days are here again. And then there was another sweet tune. Life is just a bowl of cherries. Here, remember Rudy Valley singing that. Then, there were so many others here. Oh, yes. Remember Walt Disney's Three Little Pigs,
Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Remember those three little guys? And there were a lot of big bad wolves to contend with in those days, too. Well, now the songs I've mentioned are just a very few of the hundreds that were written each year. All the songs didn't become famous, of course, but you could be assured that most of them were heard at one time or another. Now, this was a time when the radio programs were playing the hit tunes of the day. That sort of thing became popular. Novelty tunes came in and were played to death and then forgotten. Radios in homes took the place of father's fiddle while sister's piano gathered dust. Now, just why was the style of music that the radio stations were plugging? I mentioned before that we had quite a change. Jazz, which had been the thing in the 20s, temporarily faded during the early 30s, and sweet music took over. The bands of Wayne King and Guy Lombardo became popular during that time. Then along about 1934, jazz had a rebirth, took on some new characteristics, and was called swing. And again, the field of music added new words to our vocabulary. Jam sessions sprung up all over the country, and people were in the groove or going to town. No one dares to explain just exactly what swing is, but in general it's agreed that it was the hottest jazz to date. A little smoother, with a bass rhythm over which soloists improvised. There was a lot of variety in the melodies, offbeat rhythm, and, well, for heaven's sake, I think you could understand better if you just listened to it. Let me hook up the record player. These are some Benny Goodman recordings here. Here's one of them. He was a clarinetist who gained the name of King of Swing. Now just listen to this and you'll understand why. But Benny Goodman wasn't the only one of the many soloists who gained recognition during the 30s. This was a time when music arrangers began to gain importance. The popular tunes depended more and more upon the arranger. And the reason for the popularity of many of the big commercial bands was the fact that the arrangements were done so well. One of the climaxes of the decade of swing came in 1938, when the Carnival of Swing was held in New York. There were 25 bands featured, and 23,000 fans listened for 6 hours. Now that was a show. Well, the American of the 1930s was not only listening to swing music, he tuned his radio into the programs of classical nature, too, and over 10 million families listened to the symphony programs in 1939. And others were following the developments of the music of Copland and Menotti, Freddie Greffet and Blitzstein. These men were all turning the styles and techniques of popular and folk music into serious works. In 1930, Aaron Copland wrote his music ballet, Billy the Kid, and Freddie Greffet composed his familiar Grand Canyon suite. So these were the men who were arrangers and composers, and they still hold a top position on the popularity list. On the other end of the scale, we had the hillbilly ditties, which were quite a favorite with a vast number of the population. Now, when Dillinger was being hunted by the police, the hillbilly songwriters, one of them had him killed and the other had him captured alive. It's rather a weird example, but the songwriters were commenting on the times. So there we have it, the 1930s, an era of booming radio growth, an era when the new swing tunes accompanied a host of bright new faces, and an era when jitterbugs got into the groove because of the strange jivey music that was in the air. Just have a listen to this.
Well, there you have it. Well, you know, in the 1930s, I could still do a mean Lambeth walk and truck with the best of them. Say, you remember that finger-raised business? Something like this, you know? Oh.
What on earth are you doing, Howard?
Oh, just playing some swing tunes from the 1930s.
Well, I think you'd better sit down on the couch and rest.
Oh, Puff, I can truck till morning.
Well, that's all right, but you sit down anyway.
Yes, dear.
I want to read some of these debate notes I found.
Oh, you found them.
Well, yes, but you know, the way you're dancing around here, I don't know whether it's safe to read them or not.
Oh, don't have a worry in the world. I won't shake another leg.
Well, okay, if it isn't the jitterbug you're kicking around.
Well, might try the Big Apple. Or maybe take a swing at the Susie Q. Get out my zoot suit with the drape shape, you know.
Howard, no, please stick to the waltz.
Well, now, maybe you're right. The slow and graceful movement of the waltz is perhaps more compatible to my placid disposition. In fact, I almost thought I might take up toe ballet.
Toe? Oh, no, Howard. No. Do you think that you'd express the period of the 1930s that way?
Oh, might. Then again, maybe might not. You never tell. Well, anyway, you know, jitterbugging wasn't the only type of dancing.
Well, no, that's right. Now, let's see, there's Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey. Now, no doubt they were still producing modern dance shows.
Bet they were. And there was a new girl, too, Hanya Holm, was making a name for herself.
Well, it sounds like modern dancing was still growing.
Oh, you bet it was. New people coming into the field all the time, and Broadway shows being produced, and the leaders in the dance field were doing the choreography.
Hey, wait a minute. What are we doing talking about dances when I brought these notes down to read to you?
Oh, yes. Read on, McEster.
Well, now, this is one of the debates that we had at one of our town meetings. We discussed the social and economic implications of the Dust Bowl. Now, you listen. It is estimated that 1 million people were uprooted from their homes and forced on the road during the worst years.
Cinematography was by John Raditz.